From the archives of the great library of Arathes, Golden City of Elves, the wise scholars of Grey Sage present the unlikely and highly questionable accounts from those who were avowed witness. These are the suspenseful investigations of the human, Fraenk Neversleep, Arch-Preceptor of Blackroot. And now, the Neversleep Scrolls, Circle of the Mind Thief, written by Philip Walton. The story continues. Chapter 49. Ow! The triumphant blare of horns sounded as the grand procession moved slowly through the streets. Crowds pressed in thick on all sides to catch a glimpse of their champion and saviour. Not even the monarch himself received such fanfare when he came to the city. But this was a singular celebration. Riding at the focus of the column, in the high seat of honour that was not only to the right, but above that of High Lord Crispin Whiteleaf himself, Fraenk smiled and waved to the throngs as they screamed his name over and over. Fraenk felt euphoria, but under that was mostly relief. He had survived the impossible, and it was over. Now he could bask in the revelry and ride slowly through the city, letting the grateful populace have their chance to heap their adulation upon him.
Take it all in, Sir Neversleep. This is for you. You defeated the creature and saved us all.
Crispin Whiteleaf smiled, amiably shaking his elbow. I'm sure you're right, my lord, Fraenk said, struggling to recall the exact events. But how did I do it? I can't seem to remember. Whiteleaf only smiled wider and waggled a finger.
Modest as ever, I see. Just enjoy the praise. And have a look over there. They're already rebuilding your district. Blackroot will be better than before.
Fraenk twisted in his seat and could somehow see down over the distance to the docks, where freshly hewn timbers were being framed into new buildings. He could even hear the faint tock-tock-tock of hammers setting nails into beams and saws cutting boards to length. How long has it been? Fraenk asked, feeling more confused.
We've been cheering your name every moment since. Neversleep, Neversleep.
Whiteleaf jostled him with even more joviality.
Oh, and look, all your friends are here to celebrate you,
the High Lord Elf added. Fraenk saw a line of faces in the front of the crowd, Lady Blackroot and arch-partisan Olwyn Brightrock arm in arm. Kyla Gracefire stood with Nym Stonebridge and a dapper-looking kobold. There was Gwen, who wasn't in disguise for the first time Fraenk could remember, and her face was so unfamiliar, he began to doubt if it was even her. Then he saw his old friend Leos Munninger, who somehow survived his self-impalement, and for that Fraenk was very glad. Then even Lord Fernbrook, Bass Greenbrier, and Farathiel Gingerglade were in the row, clapping and cheering enthusiastically for Fraenk. Swortson Brynblade was beside them too. He wasn't sure why that sight was strange to him. The old Baker Meakin and Doran Leafwater were there as well. Finally, Fraenk saw his mother and father. They looked much the same as they did when Fraenk was a boy, but they both seemed happy, and it made his heart break. I'm dead, Fraenk said in answer to his own unspoken question.
What? No.
Whiteleaf clapped him on the shoulder a little too hard.
You don't die for another few weeks. Terrible thing, that. Just enjoy your parade, for we love you, and it will be all the recognition you ever get for your bravery. Now, sir, listen to those crowds cheer your name.
The throng had taken up a singular chant, saying it over and over. Neversleep! Neversleep! Neversleep!
Neversleep!
Someone slapped him hard in the face. Fraenk opened his eyes to see Kyla leaning over him. Ow! Frank's head throbbed something fierce.
Get up, Neversleep. We have to move or that monster's going to find us.
I defeated it already, Fraenk said groggily. The High Lord threw me a parade.
No. The falling wood hit you. I think your brain is addled. Here, drink this.
He felt a curve of glass pressed to his lips and a cool liquid filled his mouth. It tasted sweet at first, like honey and spring mint, but that was just to cover the bitter medicinal notes that hit a moment later. He nearly spit it out, but she pressed her hand over his mouth and made him swallow.
Extract of melon fire. You won't thank me in a few hours when it wears off, if we even have that long,
Kyla said. It took only moments, but Fraenk suddenly felt a prickling chill run through his extremities. He sat up, oddly energized, the fatigue and pain in his muscles being overrun with a dangerous new urge to get up and do more, along with the heady confidence that he definitely could. Fraenk took a quick moment to orient himself. At first he thought Kyla had somehow dragged him to another location because all he saw was a spider's web of thick chains crisscrossing in all directions and pulled groaningly tight. In fact, the whole building seemed to creak and protest under some unseen labour. It was dark where Fraenk sat, but a shaft of moonlight was spilling in from a long row of open windows. They were sitting up on a catwalk, high in the upper section of the dry dock, where all the suspension rigging was built into the dock. Directly below was the galleon and the Leviathan. Not yet aware of Frank's escape, its twin tentacles still thrashed and writhed, searching for him. He could see the entire ship moving slightly as the creature worked itself further underneath it. It made frustrated pig-like grunts and snuffs as it forced itself deeper into the trench.
Let's go!
Kyla urged, pulling him toward the windows which led out onto the roof and to safety. But Fraenk hesitated. The protesting metal of the chains and moving ship meant it was now held entirely by the elaborate suspension network in the ceiling. This crane rig was designed to slowly raise much smaller ships onto the blocks, and was certainly not supposed to get knocked around by monsters. Fraenk's eyes followed the thick chains up from the four corners of the galleon, which eventually all met together at one enormous block and pulley wheel, which was itself the near dimensions of a small ship. The entire building was groaning under forces which its craftsmen and engineers had never anticipated. Down below, if Bultzone the Leviathan had been left to its own agency, it might not have been continuing to probe for Fraenk beneath the hull of the ship. But under the yoke of Dandrikan, it was doggedly attempting to destroy him. Fraenk saw Dandrikan and his cloud belt, floating closer to the creature, as if to oversee its progress. There was something off about the way Dandrikan moved, mindless and open-mouthed. He also noticed thin red lines tracing down from the corners of the man's eyes and the openings of his ears, and Fraenk realized it was blood. The strain of keeping this monster yoked must have been enormous.
What are you waiting for? It's busy. Let's go!
Kyla gave him another worried pull. Her expression showed what he was already thinking. If they didn't get out soon, this entire place would collapse on them. Perhaps it was all his years on the streets, fighting for every scrap and facing danger for daily survival, but Fraenk grew very good at spotting an opportunity. And in the chaos of a dynamic situation, there were moments he could exploit to his advantage. There was one time he had stolen a guard's coin purse as he was being hauled away. Not only had he eaten better than he had in months, but his reputation on the streets had risen to the point of alley rat celebrity, if there was such a thing. So risk-taking became his trade, and seeing those chances coming was his study. Even in the most dire circumstances, could turn by a single twist of fate. He could feel that something about the situation was one such moment. Fraenk located a set of ropes that lead from the central pulley across the rafters, turned, and then went down to levers near the far wall. This was exactly what he was looking for.
Fraenk!
Kyla pleaded. Go on! I'm right behind you. Fraenk lied, knowing he had to get her outside before attempting what he was about to do. She looked doubtful, but started off toward the window. Fraenk found the control ropes for the suspension rig. One would disengage the locking mechanism, the other held it in place, and he didn't know which was which. It meant he had half a chance to get this right. He reached for the last remaining throwing knife on his belt, but it was not there. Then a blade sank into his back. Fraenk sucked in a breath of pain as well as surprise. He reached back for the weapon, pivoting to see who had stabbed him. His first thought was Dandrikan had somehow found him and was trying to kill him. But when he turned, only Kyla was standing there. Stupidly, he almost asked her if she saw who had stabbed him, but then he saw her face and understood. Her eyes were unfocused, and she stood at a stiff angle. She lashed out with a flurry of hits that rocked Fraenk backward. He reflexively raised his hands in a combat stance, ready to counter another salvo, but Dandrikan's voice turned his attention.
Fraenk, I thought we lost you.
a hateful voice intoned, and then Dandrikan floated up into view. He wiped furiously at the thick tracks of blood on his cheeks, leaving a red smear. There was a red trail of mucus flowing from both nostrils. "Dandrikan, you're dying." Fraenk winced in pain.
You don't look so hot yourself, Neversleep.
Dandrikan sneered back. Fraenk saw on Dandrikan's chest the necklace, encased in a thick crust of ice like a breastplate. Perhaps if he could break or somehow dislodge it, he could stop Dandrikan's scheme. He reached back, taking hold of the dagger's handle. A bolt of agony shot through his body.
Oh, I wouldn't do that, Fraenk,
he said.
Looks like it's in your kidney. Pull that out, and you'll bleed to death in minutes. Actually, go ahead. I'm just going to kill you anyway.
It would be worth it just to slit your foul neck, Fraenk spat.
Then this pretty thing dies too.
Dandrikan purred. Kyla turned mechanically and walked toward the edge of the catwalk. She moved one foot out over the edge, ready to step into oblivion. "Wait! Stop! You win, Dandrikan! Please, please don't!" Fraenk pleaded.
Why shouldn't I?
He smiled cruelly. "Because," Fraenk started, "I'll tell you something you don't know about the Mind Thief." Dandrikan looked skeptical at first, then intrigued. Kyla stepped backward, wavering idly.
Well?
He demanded. Fraenk sighed heavily. He felt his strength ebbing. Dandrikan's brows etched together suspiciously, but curiosity clearly got the better of him.
Tell me quick, Neversleep. This one is about to have a terrible accident.
"Wait, stop! It's simply this." Fraenk sighed, then threw up his hands, defeated. The necklace makes what one mind experiences happen to the other as well. They are linked.
And why would I care about that?
Dandrikan asked with narrowed eyes. "I'll show you." With a grunt, Fraenk pulled the blade from his back, and in a single fluid motion, flung it at the wall. The knife struck with a satisfying clunk and splatter of blood, splitting the fibres nearly all the way through. One single tenacious strand hung on, but the rest of the rope unravelled perilously in both directions. That one cursed strand held, pulled to the very limits of tension, and Frank's heart sank. That was it, his last move. He could feel blood spilling from his back and his body weakening, that one strand of dull cord which refused to. Spang! What was once a stubborn strand of rope one moment vaporized into a cloud of fibres, and everything around Fraenk became motion. The chains in the ceiling rattled out with great shuttering force through blocks and pulleys. Enormous counterweights set on all sides of the building began to rise, and the entire building shook violently, with a deep, primordial moan. Fraenk had but a brief moment to worry that the entire structure might cavitate apart. A massive boom echoed through the docks, and a brilliant flare of light ran the entire length of the hull as the ward spell took a massive hit. Then a sound issued from beneath the galleon that was so terrible that if he had any blades left, Fraenk would have been tempted to cut his own ears off just to make it stop. It felt like the tortured chorus of 1,000,000 damned souls all wailing at the same time. The monster's tentacles stiffened straight upright briefly, then fell with a numb, fleshy flop. One nearly hit Fraenk before they both slid over the side of the ship, leaving long, slimy trails. The deck shuddered violently as the beast thrashed its limbs and body against the hull. Its back arched and pulled, its tentacles now pinned under the immense weight of the galleon, as it continued to issue high, anguished barks. It bucked mightily, and the ship thumped in response. It was currently trapped, but it wouldn't last long. Hovering in space beside the catwalk, Dandrikan cried out and clutched his nose, the monster's pain an echo in his own body. Fraenk saw the ship below him was teetering precariously on its keel. If it tilted over to one side, the Leviathan could free itself to continue its rampage unabated through Arathis. Given the way the beast was pulling, that seemed the most likely outcome. But Fraenk needed the galleon to fall the other way. Fraenk looked down at the dizzying distance between himself and the main deck. A fall from this height would mean instant death, He felt a gush of warm blood running down his back, but it didn't matter. He knew what must be done. Fraenk launched himself forward and off the catwalk. For a breathless moment he flew. Then Fraenk collided heavily with Dandrikan. They spun entwined, wildly for several dizzying moments, dropping fast until Dandrikan managed to right himself. Fraenk grasped the buckle of the cloud belt and unlatched it. His foe uttered a pathetic shriek before they both dropped, accelerating fast towards the ground. Fraenk grabbed Dandrikan close and arched onto his body just as they hit the boards of the ship. They both tumbled toward the gunwales as the ship began to tilt. Fraenk turned as the deck skewed. Bultsoen the Leviathan rose level with the edge of the main deck, its many terrible eyes fixed on Fraenk and its horrible mouth open to catch him as he slid. Dandrikan had grasped a loose rope and was holding on. He cackled as Fraenk slid ever closer to the open mouth of the creature.
Goodbye, Fraenk!
Dandrikan shouted. Fraenk could do nothing but helplessly slide toward the terrible maw of the Leviathan. Then its hunger suddenly turned to surprise as the galleon pinned the monster against the wall of the channel. The weight of the tilting galleon was pressure, strong at first, grew by exponential magnitudes with each moment. All Bultsoen could do was scream. Dandrikan, who was experiencing everything as well, scrambled to pull the necklace from his body, but could only beat against the icy bulwark around it. The Leviathan uttered an unearthly roar, an anguish only matched by Dandrikan's wail. Then its head shattered in a massive spray of viscera, blood, and brain matter. Fraenk slid uncontrollably into a hot, pillowy mass of wet mazard as the galleon hit the side of the wall with an earth-vibrating boom. A massive yellow eyeball fell into his lap, fixing him with a dull, questioning gaze. Fraenk yelped, scrambling backward out of the monster's destroyed head. Then a body slid toward him, landing just within arm's reach. Dandrikan looked ahead with lifeless eyes, blood erupting from every opening. "I warned you," Fraenk said. He saw that the ice brace around Dandrikan's chest had shattered open. There at its core was the Mind Thief necklace, but it looked different. Then Fraenk saw why. The crystal at its core was splintered with deep cracks. Even looking at it felt different. Fraenk felt no aversion to seeing it. The Mind Thief no longer made him bored or want to look away. Somehow its magical effects seemed totally gone. Perhaps Dandrikan had pushed the item beyond what it could handle, somehow beyond what it could bear. And now it lay destroyed. Perhaps that was the best outcome after all. It was what Brightrock had wanted, and if Fraenk was being honest, something he had no idea how to accomplish on his own. But even though it was destroyed, Fraenk knew it wasn't the end of it. Others might try to repair or recover it given the chance. He would have to make sure everyone knew it was finally over, that the Mind Thief would never be active again. As he lay, an uncomfortable pain dug into his hip, and Fraenk shifted, reaching for the offending item. Fraenk had felt a loop of chain and pulled it up into view. Then he began to laugh. Olwyn Brightrock had given him one more blessing. The decoy necklace he'd slipped into Fraenk's pocket looked almost indistinguishable from its original. Fraenk let it dangle in the light and smiled. Thank you for listening. Tune in next week for another exciting episode. And remember, the learned scholars of Grey Sage caution you that the veracity of these events remains unproven. Now go safe in the light of the powers, until our hands clasp again.